There's a mountain in western Tibet that stands 6,638 meters tall. And in all of recorded history, not one single human being has ever stood on its summit. Not because nobody has tried, not because it is too high, because it is not even close to being the tallest mountain in the region, not because it is the most dangerous, because far deadlier peaks have been climbed dozens of times. The reason nobody has ever reached the top of Mount Kailash is one of the strangest stories in the modern world, and once you hear it, you will never look at mountains the same way again. Let's start with the raw facts, because they are strange enough on their own without adding anything extra to them. Mount Kailash sits in the remote Ngari region of western Tibet. Its height is around 21,700 feet. To put that in context, Everest is over 29,000 feet, and dozens of Himalayan peaks are taller and harder to climb than Kailash. In terms of pure difficulty, mountaineers who have studied it say it is technically possible to climb. It is not covered in unclimbable ice walls. It does not have the kind of vertical death zones that make K2 the most feared mountain on Earth. And yet, in a world where human beings have climbed Everest more than 12,000 times, where people have skied down K2, where teenagers have summited all 14 of the world's 8,000-meter peaks, Mount Kailash remains completely untouched. No footprints, no flags, no official summit photo, nothing. So why? The answer is not a secret. It is not hidden knowledge revealed by monks who broke a vow of silence. It is something even stranger in its own way, because it is completely open, completely documented. And yet, most of the world has never heard it. Mount Kailash has never been climbed because billions of people across 4 of the world's major religions consider it far too sacred to touch. Let that sink in for a second. In a world that has mapped the ocean floor, sent robots to Mars, and dragged flags up every mountain on the planet, there is one peak that remains untouched purely out of respect. That alone makes it one of the strangest places left on Earth. Here is where it gets even more interesting. Mount Kailash is not sacred to just one religion or two. It is considered the holiest place on the planet by 4 completely separate belief systems that developed independently of each other, in different languages, in different centuries, often with no contact between them at all. In Hinduism, Kailash is believed to be the eternal home of Lord Shiva, one of the most important gods in the entire religion. Ancient Hindu texts describe the mountain as the axis of the world, the central point around which all of existence turns. In Tibetan Buddhism, the mountain is called Kong Rinpoche, which means the precious snow mountain, and it is believed to be the dwelling place of a Buddha associated with supreme bliss. It is also identified with Mount Meru, the mythical mountain said to sit at the very center of Buddhist cosmology. In Jainism, the mountain is known as Mount Ashtapada, and it is believed to be the place where the very first Jain spiritual teacher achieved liberation. And in Bon, the ancient religion of Tibet that existed even before Buddhism arrived there, Kailash is considered the axis mundi, the point that connects heaven and earth, the place where prayers rise upward and blessings come back down. 4 different religions, 4 different histories, 4 different sets of scriptures written centuries and sometimes thousands of years apart. And every single one of them landed on the exact same mountain as the most sacred place in existence. Every year, tens of thousands of pilgrims travel from India, Nepal, and across the world to walk a 52-kilometer path around the base of the mountain, a journey called the Kora. They do not attempt to climb it, they walk around it, believing the act itself brings spiritual transformation. Some devout pilgrims perform the entire circuit through full-body prostrations, lying down, standing up, and lying down again, for the entire distance, a journey that can take weeks. Now here is the part of the story most people never learned. Mount Kailash is not just untouched by tradition, it is actually banned, officially, legally banned. In 2001, a Spanish mountaineering team was reportedly given permission by Chinese authorities to attempt the summit. This was a huge deal because permits for Kailash had almost never been granted before. But the moment word got out, the reaction was immediate and massive. Religious communities across India, Nepal, and Tibet protested. One of the most respected mountaineers alive, Reinhold Messner, the first person in history to climb all 14 of the world's peaks above 8,000 meters, spoke out publicly against the idea. He said that if climbers conquered that mountain, they would be conquering something inside the souls of the people who consider it holy, and he said he would never go there himself. Sir Edmund Hillary, the first person to ever summit Everest, also refused to attempt Kailash out of respect for its spiritual meaning. Under this pressure, the Chinese government reversed course and permanently banned all climbing expeditions on the mountain. To this day, no climbing permit has ever been issued again. Not for money, not for fame, not for science. There is no base camp. There are no fixed ropes. There's no official route up the mountain at all because officially nobody's allowed to try. Mount Kailash may be the only mountain on the entire planet that has legal protection, specifically because it is considered too sacred to climb, rather than because it is a nature reserve or a dangerous zone. Think about that. Everest has been turned into something close to a tourist attraction, with long lines of climbers waiting their turn near the summit. Kailash, a smaller, technically easier mountain, remains completely untouched because an enormous portion of humanity has agreed, across religions and across borders, that some places should be left alone. Now, let's talk about the shape of the mountain itself, because this is where things start to feel less like coincidence and more like mystery. Most mountains on Earth are shaped by millions of years of random natural forces. Wind, ice, tectonic pressure, and erosion carve them into jagged, uneven, irregular shapes. That is simply how nature works. There is no reason for a mountain to be symmetrical, but Kailash breaks that pattern in a way that catches the eye of anyone who sees it, even people who know nothing about geology. The mountain has 4 distinct faces that roughly correspond to the 4 cardinal directions: north, south, east, and west. Its overall shape has often been compared to a giant pyramid rising out of the Tibetan plateau, with lines and ridges running down its faces that some describe as looking almost deliberately carved. Geologists explain this through a mix of the mountain's unique rock composition and the specific way ice and wind have worn away at it over an extremely long period of time. There is a scientific explanation, but even scientists who study the mountain admit that its symmetry is unusual, and it is easy to understand why. For thousands of years, people looking up at this mountain felt they were looking at something that was placed there on purpose rather than something that simply happened by accident. Next, let's talk about water, because this is a fact that needs no myth, no legend, and no exaggeration to be extraordinary on its own. 4 of the largest and most important rivers in all of Asia begin their journey within just a few dozen miles of Mount Kailash. The Indus River, which flows through Tibet, India, and Pakistan. The Sutlej River, a major tributary that feeds northern India. The Brahmaputra, one of the largest rivers on the entire planet by volume, flowing through Tibet, India, and Bangladesh. And the Karnali, a major tributary of the Ganges, flowing down through Nepal. 4 enormous river systems, each flowing outward in a different direction, north, south, east, and west, all beginning in the shadow of the very same mountain. Together, these rivers provide fresh water to well over 1 billion people across South Asia. Geographers consider this region one of the most important watersheds anywhere on the planet. Ancient Hindu texts describe Mount Meru, the mythical cosmic mountain at the center of the universe, as the source of 4 sacred rivers flowing outward in 4 directions. When modern geographers finally mapped the actual source of Asia's greatest rivers, they found real mountains matching that ancient description almost perfectly. Whether you see that as an incredible coincidence or as evidence that ancient people understood their geography far better than we usually give them credit for, the fact itself is not up for debate. It is simply true, and it is genuinely remarkable. Now, no story about Kailash would be complete without talking about the legends, because this is where fact and folklore blur together in a way that has fascinated travelers for centuries. Old Russian expedition accounts from the region describe strange stories among local guides and pilgrims, tales of travelers who spent time near the mountain and returned, appearing to have aged strangely with hair and nails that seemed to have grown far more than the short time away should have allowed. These stories were passed down as folklore long before anyone thought to study them scientifically, and no controlled scientific study has ever confirmed anything like this actually happening. There is no verified medical case of unexplained rapid aging near Kailash. But the legend persisted for a reason. High altitude, thin oxygen, intense cold, and physical exhaustion do strange things to the human body and the human mind. And for travelers, pushing themselves to the limit in one of the most remote places on Earth, it is easy to see how physical exhaustion could turn into stories that grew stranger with each retelling. There are also long-standing traveler accounts describing an odd reluctance, almost a psychological wall, that some people report feeling as they approach the upper reaches of the mountain. Whether that comes from altitude, from the thin air affecting judgment and mood, from genuine spiritual reverence built up over a lifetime of belief, or simply from the power of walking toward a place your entire culture has told you, since childhood is too sacred to touch, is impossible to fully separate. What is true is that no expedition has ever pushed past that point and reached the top, whether by choice, by law, or by both. So where does that leave us? Strip away the exaggerated legends, and you're still left with a mountain that is genuinely one of the strangest places on Earth, not because of anything supernatural, but because of what human beings collectively chose to do with it. 4 major world religions, developing independently across thousands of years and thousands of miles, all identified this exact same peak as the most sacred place in existence. The most experienced mountaineers alive, people who have stood on top of the tallest and deadliest peaks on the planet, looked at an easier mountain and chose to walk away, not because they could not climb it, but because they believed some things matter more than adding another name to a list of summits. A government formally banned climbing on a mountain, not to protect an ecosystem, but to protect a belief held by well over 1 billion people. And beneath it all, quite literally, 4 of the greatest rivers in Asia begin flowing outward from the base of this single mountain, feeding well over 1 billion lives in a pattern that ancient scripture described long before anyone had the tools to map it. Maybe there is nothing mysterious happening at Mount Kailash beyond geology, hydrology, and the raw power of shared human belief. Or maybe the fact that so many different cultures, separated by language, geography, and centuries of history, independently arrived at reverence for the exact same mountain is itself the real mystery worth sitting with. Either way, in a world where almost nowhere is left unexplored, where drones fly over rainforests and submarines map the deepest ocean trenches, there remains one mountain in western Tibet that has never felt a single human footstep on its summit. And as long as the people who consider it holy have anything to say about it, it never will. Let's go a little deeper into the history, because the story of how this band came to exist did not happen overnight, and it says a lot about how the modern world treats places like this. Long before the 2001 controversy with the Spanish team, Mount Kailash had already survived nearly a century of near misses. During the era of British colonial exploration in the region, surveyors and explorers mapped much of the surrounding Himalayan terrain in extraordinary detail, searching for potential routes up almost every major peak they encountered. Kailash was surveyed as well. Its height was measured, its faces were sketched, possible approaches were studied on paper. And yet, even during a period when European explorers were racing to plant flags on unclimbed peaks across the world, nobody organized a serious attempt on Kailash. Local guides, porters, and communities living in the shadow of the mountain refused to assist any expedition that intended to reach the summit, and outside explorers largely respected that refusal, whether out of genuine sensitivity or simple practicality, since no expedition succeeds in one of the most remote regions on Earth without the cooperation of the people who actually live there. That pattern continued for decades. Long before any government law existed banning the climb, the mountain was protected by something far older and, in some ways, far stronger than any legal document: the collective will of the people who lived around it and depended on its rivers, and who had grown up hearing that this particular peak was not like other peaks. When the 2001 incident finally happened, it became a turning point precisely because it broke that unspoken agreement. A formal permit had reportedly been discussed, and for a brief moment, it looked as though modern mountaineering was finally going to catch up with this one remaining exception. The backlash that followed was not limited to a handful of monks or a single religious group. It came from Hindu organizations across India, from Buddhist communities across Tibet, Nepal, and beyond, and from cultural preservation groups who saw the mountain as belonging to humanity's shared spiritual heritage, rather than to any single climbing team's list of accomplishments. Reinhold Messner's public refusal carried enormous weight in the mountaineering world, specifically because of who he was. This was not an armchair critic. This was the single most accomplished high-altitude climber in human history, a man who had already conquered the 14 tallest and most dangerous mountains on the planet without supplemental oxygen, at a time when most experts believed that feat was physically impossible. When a climber with that level of authority says a mountain should be left alone, the climbing world listens differently than it would to anyone else. Under that pressure, from religious communities, from respected climbers, and from international attention, the Chinese government formally closed the door. No permits since, no exceptions. And unlike many other restricted areas around the world that eventually reopen once controversy fades, Kailash has remained closed for well over 2 decades now, with no serious indication that this will ever change. It is worth pausing here to address something that circulates online from time to time: the claim that satellite agencies or research organizations have discovered some kind of hidden scientific reason the mountain cannot physically be climbed, some undisclosed anomaly in its structure. This is simply not true, and it is worth saying clearly. There's no credible scientific body that has declared Kailash physically unclimbable. Mountaineers who have studied its slopes describe genuine technical challenges: steep faces, unstable scree, extreme cold, and thin oxygen at altitude, the same kinds of obstacles found on many Himalayan peaks. But nothing about the mountain places it beyond human capability in the way Everest's Death Zone or K2's bottleneck couloir do. The real barrier has never been the rock. It has always been the decision, made collectively and repeatedly by governments, by climbers, and by the people who consider the mountain holy, that some summits are not meant to be reached. Now let's return to the pilgrimage itself, because the Kora is worth understanding in more detail, since it is the closest most people will ever come to the mountain, and it is an experience unlike almost anything else on Earth. The full circuit covers roughly 52 kilometers of high-altitude terrain, most of it above 15,000 feet, with a demanding pass called the Dolmala that climbs above 18,000 feet before descending back down the other side. Pilgrims typically complete the walk over the course of 2 or 3 days, though the devout believe that completing it even once in this lifetime helps wash away the sins of a lifetime. And Tibetan Buddhist tradition holds that completing 108 circuits can lead to enlightenment within that very life. Along the path, pilgrims pass prayer flags strung across the valley in every direction, sky burial sites used in traditional Tibetan funerary practice, and small shrines built into the rock where travelers leave offerings as they pass. Some of the most devout pilgrims choose to perform the entire distance through full-body prostrations, lying face down on the ground, marking the spot their fingertips reached, standing, walking to that mark, and lying down again, repeating this for the full 52 kilometers in a journey that can take several weeks of exhausting, freezing, physically punishing devotion. Nobody requires this of them. They choose it because, to them, the mountain is worth that kind of sacrifice. It is also worth noting just how remote this entire region actually is, because that remoteness is part of what has allowed the mountain's mystery to survive into the modern era at all. The nearest town, Darkin, sits at roughly 15,000 feet and functions as the staging point for pilgrims beginning the Kora. Getting there at all requires a long overland journey across the Tibetan plateau, often taking several days from Lhasa or from the Nepal border, across some of the highest inhabited terrain on the planet. There are no highways leading directly to the mountain, no airports nearby, and no easy way to simply show up. This isolation has meant that, unlike Everest, which has slowly been transformed by decades of commercial expeditions, fixed ropes, and long lines of climbers waiting for their turn near the summit, Kailash has remained almost exactly as it has always been, a remote, windswept, snow-covered peak rising alone above the plateau, visited by pilgrims on foot rather than climbers with ropes and oxygen tanks. It also helps to understand that Kailash is not entirely alone in this. There are a small number of other peaks around the world that remain unclimbed for similar reasons, and looking at them side by side makes the pattern even clearer. In Nepal, a striking fishtail-shaped peak called Machapuchare has never been officially submitted, after a British expedition in the 1950s stopped just short of the top, out of respect for local belief that the mountain is sacred to the god Shiva, and the government later closed it to climbing entirely. In Bhutan, the country has gone even further, banning the climbing of any peak above 6,000 meters anywhere within its borders, specifically to preserve the spiritual beliefs of its population, which means the towering Gangkhar Puensum, one of the tallest unclimbed mountains on Earth, remains untouched, not because it cannot be climbed, but because an entire nation decided it should not be. What makes Kailash different from even these examples is scale. Machapuchare and Gangkhar Puensum are protected largely by the beliefs and laws of a single country. Kailash is protected by the shared reverence of well over 1 billion people spread across several countries and 4 entirely different religious traditions, which is part of why its story has traveled so much further around the world. There's one more angle to this story that deserves attention, because it says something about how differently the modern world treats different kinds of sacred ground. Across the world, there are countless places that were once considered untouchable and have since been opened, developed, or climbed regardless of local objection. Sacred forests have been cleared, burial grounds have been built over, holy rivers have been dammed. Mount Kailash stands out precisely because it represents one of the rare cases where a government, an entire mountaineering community, and multiple religious traditions, spanning more than 1 billion people, all arrived at the same conclusion and actually held to it for decades without wavering. In an age where almost nothing on Earth remains unmapped, unclimbed, or untouched, that alone makes Kailash worth paying attention to, not because of any secret hidden beneath it, but because of what it reveals about what happens when enough people, across enough different beliefs, agree that some things are worth more than being conquered. That is the real story of Mount Kailash, not a secret chamber, not a hidden prophecy, not some mysterious force stopping climbers in their tracks. Just a mountain that an enormous portion of the human race decided, together, across religions, across governments, and across centuries, was worth leaving alone. And somehow, in a world that has climbed, mapped, and photographed almost everything else, that decision turned out to be one of the most powerful and enduring stories on the planet. If this made you look at mountains a little differently, stick around, because the world is full of places like this. Places where the real story, the true story, is stranger and more powerful than anything anyone would ever need to make up.